Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles. After another wild day on Wall Street, with less than 8 hours to go until the largest U.S. tariffs in 100-plus years take effect, with no clear exit strategy or endgame from the White House. Now, stocks opened the day with a big rally, fueled by hope that the worst of the tariffs could be avoided with the president's openness to negotiations. But that optimism faded, and stocks tumbled into the red, with the Dow falling for the fourth straight day, down roughly 300 points, after the White House confirmed that tariffs on Chinese imports would in fact skyrocket to 104% starting at midnight, and with Beijing saying it will, quote, fight to the end. At the White House today, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt also confirming that every single one of those sweeping new tariffs on virtually every U.S. trading partner will go into effect tonight, and that the president's trade team was ready to begin talks.
The president met with his trade team this morning, and he directed them to have tailor-made trade deals with each and every country that calls up this administration to strike a deal. And listen, and each and every one of these trade deals should be tailored and unique based on that country's markets, based on that country's exports, the imports here in the United States of America. What makes the most sense for the American worker and for our industry?
Now, this all comes as the president's top representative on trade, Jamieson Greer, testified before Congress today, offering little clarity about a timeline for the talks.
Our large and persistent trade deficit has been over 30 years in the making, and it will not be resolved overnight, but all of this is in the right direction. So the president has indicated that he's willing to negotiate with parties that want to pursue reciprocal trade with the United States. We don't have any particular timeline set on that because, as you pointed out, Senator, the outcome is more important than setting something artificially for us. Senator, the president has been clear with me and with others that he does not intend to have exclusions and exemptions, especially given the nature of the action.
Meanwhile, a public drama of epic proportions is playing out between two top members of the president's inner circle over his trade agenda, with Doge chief Elon Musk calling the president's trade advisor Peter Navarro a, quote, moron who is, quote, dumber than a sack of bricks. That came in response to comments from Navarro blasting Musk for signaling doubt about the president's tariff policies. This was Caroline Leavitt's response.
Look, these are obviously two individuals who have very different views on trade and on tariffs. Boys will be boys, and we will let their public sparring continue.
All right, let's talk about all of this. Joining me now are CNBC senior markets correspondent Bob Pisani, NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hilliard, and NBC's Jesse Kirsch, who's been speaking with Floridians who are retired or nearing retirement about their economic concerns. So, Bob, let's start with you. The markets rallied to start the day. Things looked better for investors. Then it all went south pretty quickly. What happened?
Well, we did start up 4%, and the hope was that there might be some kind of end game to these endless tariff wars that are going on. The countries had indicated that they were calling the White House, and the markets were hopeful that there was some kind of resolution down the road. Then, of course, we had the China defiance, and that was a major issue. And I think that was a major, major problem for the markets. You look like a stock like Apple down almost 6% again today. So that's a huge impact on the market. Apple is the biggest stock in the world right now. So Apple, of course, the iPhone is designed in California, but it's manufactured in China. So the bottom line is the stock market is trying to adjust its earnings expectations for the possibility that corporate America's earnings are going to be much lower if most of these tariffs are implemented. And we cannot figure out how serious or how likely the implementation of these tariffs are. Now that we have this deadline in front of us, it looks like it's actually going to be some real impact.
And obviously there's been so much volatility around the speculation that the actual tariffs would take effect. What could happen tomorrow if there are no deals done and they actually do take effect?
Remember, the stock market is a voting mechanism on a future stream of profits down the road, 6 months to a year. The profits for this year generally were considered to be pretty good. The U.S. economy going into this was strong. Job growth was a little slower overall, but the U.S. economy was quite strong, and earnings expectations were very high for this year. The market hit a historic high in the middle of February, just a month and a half ago. That's how strong expectations were. But if you have to layer on tariffs, Tariffs are inflationary. The market believes they are inflationary. The market believes they are a drag on earnings and a drag on the global economy. It's going to hold a whole rethink of the global economic system. That is not what the market is prepared for right now. So right now we are close to 20% drop in the S&P 500 from its high. We're not clear right now about whether that's fully accounting for the full impact of these tariffs. What makes everybody crazy, Ryan, is that all of this could change with a tweet. We're not talking about global economics here. We're talking about people who can decide what the tariff levels can be very, very quickly. And so the market mood may change tomorrow. That makes everybody a little bit crazy.
Yeah, and obviously there's some kind of, concern, questions from investors about whether or not these negotiations are actually going to take place, whether or not these tariffs stay in place. Look down the road for me a little bit. What if these negotiations start, but then no actual deals ever come to fruition and the tariffs are in place long term? How could that impact the markets?
That would be a long-term structural change to the global order. So globalism, no matter what you might think of it, made everything more efficient. It lowered prices. It generally lowered inflation because you had supply chains concentrated in certain areas around the world. People made semiconductors in certain areas. A lot of cheap, like clothing manufacturing, for example, might have gone somewhere else to other countries. And it made supply chains very efficiently. If you have to start building everything very close to the United States or in the United States, that means much higher costs. I'll give you an idea. A U.S. automobile worker makes about $70 an hour in the United States. In Mexico, makes about $6. In Canada, makes about $40. That's an enormous difference in prices, and that's one of the reasons that you have some of these differences in the costs of making these automobiles.
Okay, this is not a question that's going to be answered at least immediately. So, Bob, will stick with us and keep us updated as the markets continue to go up and down, waiting to see how President Trump's going to handle this. Let's go now to the White House, and that's where Vaughn Hilliard's standing by. And, Vaughn, President Trump keeps hinting that he'd like to negotiate on these tariffs. But do we have any indication that there are actually any real deals in the works yet?
His Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, suggested earlier today that the White House was engaged in conversations with Vietnamese and Japanese officials about a potential tariff deal or agreement. Of course, Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu was at the White House yesterday and suggested that he would look to eliminate all trade barriers between the U.S. and Israel. Yet, in response, when President Trump was asked whether he would take off the 17% tariff he levied on Israel in return, he would not make that commitment. So it's not clear exactly what the president is willing to do in terms of eliminating the tariffs that he is now imposing, because at one point these were hearkened as or being touted as being permanent tariffs. Yet what we have heard now over the last 24 hours, including this afternoon from Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, is that the White House has opened ears and that 70 nations have reached out and that their message to other countries is to, quote, come with your best offer, according to Caroline Leavitt. But what type of concessions do they have to make? That's not quite clear. And how quickly could those deals be done? Well, that's going to be difficult too, Ryan, because if folks go back to the first Trump administration, the USMCA trade agreement with Mexico and Canada took nearly 2 years to negotiate, as acknowledged by U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, who was up on Capitol Hill today. In the Phase 1 trade agreement that was struck between China and the Trump administration back in 2019 and 2020, just that Phase 1 agreement took nearly 2 years to negotiate too. So there's a lot of serious questions still for the White House.
And there is some disagreement among President Trump's top advisors as to how this should play out. It's led to an ongoing dispute between Peter Navarro, who is perhaps the biggest cheerleader for tariffs in the White House, and, of course, Elon Musk, who's become one of Trump's most trusted aides. Walk us through how this whole thing started and where it stands now.
Right. Peter Navarro is his chief trade advisor and really has been the proponent of the most strictest tariff plan, and one that the president has really echoed repeatedly over the course of the last weeks and months. And he is somebody who, right, for instance, is really of the belief that these tariffs should be permanent and should be, in most cases, non-negotiable. And yet Elon Musk, over the course of the last several days on his social media account, has been public in suggesting that there should be 0-for-0 tariff agreement struck between the EU, the U.S., and other countries, a very different posture. And what have we heard in response? Well, Peter Navarro pushed back almost as a slight to Elon Musk, suggesting he's not a car manufacturer, but a car assembler, suggesting he's relying on foreign auto parts. And then in return this morning, we saw Elon Musk call Peter Navarro, quote, dumb as bricks, and, quote, moron. So that is sort of the internal dialogue taking place. Caroline Levitt was asked about the two close advisors' public spat, and she said boys will be boys, and she encouraged them to debate the merits of tariffs for all the public to witness, Ryan.
And said that their open disagreements in public will continue, as a matter of fact. So, Vaughn Hilliard, thank you for that reporting from the White House. We appreciate it. Let's go out into the country and see how people are responding to this. That's where we find Jesse Kirsch. He is with a group of seniors. Jesse, how concerned are they about these looming tariffs and how it could affect their nest eggs that they're relying on for their retirement?
Yes, so Ryan, we've heard a mix of opinions from people, some taking the wait-and-see approach, right, sharing what we often think about with the stock market is look at it as a long-term play. Let's see how things look months from now. But there are also some people who are taking immediate action and altering their spending habits, including one gentleman I spoke with who says he's a retiree, lives down here in Florida, and is going to be changing some of what he does and some of the big purchases that he might be making based on what is happening right now with the stock market. Here's part of our conversation.
I had some money in the market. It's now depleted. It's probably half of what I had. All right? And it seems like it's going to get worse. You can't do this to the public. It's, you know, he's got to consult with Congress, and they got to do something about this. Just stop it.
And that gentleman was speaking to me about some of the things he'll be changing for the time being. He says he's not going to be going out to eat at restaurants. He had plans to buy a new car. He's not going to be doing that right now. So that's the real-time, right, trickle-down effect of people's reaction to what's going on in the stock market, Ryan.
And are they more worried about their investments, their stocks, or the potential inflation that could be caused by this pending trade war and how much they're going to have to spend on everyday goods?
Yeah, I think my conversation with that gentleman, again, really points to that question as well, Ryan. When I started talking to him about what's been going on, the tariffs, the stock market, the first thing he started talking about is that prices are still up. There's still an inflation issue. So I think that is still top of mind for some people, in addition, right, to these eye-popping headlines about what has been going on in the stock market over the last week or so. And one other thing that I thought was really interesting that stuck out to me from my conversation with that man is, you know, there's been a lot of talk not just about what is happening with the market in relation to these tariff policies, but also just the idea of whether or not tariffs are a good thing. And there's some people that shun the idea of tariffs broadly. That gentleman is an example of someone who says he doesn't think that what is happening right now, the way the tariff policy is being implemented, is the right approach, but he didn't have a problem with the idea of tariffs broadly, Ryan. So that'll be something that I'll be wanting to keep an eye on moving forward.
Okay, Jesse Kirsch, thank you so much for that. Let's talk now with Jared Bernstein, who is the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and he's the former chief economist to then Vice President Joe Biden. Jared, before we get started here, I just want to play a little bit more from today's hearing with the current U.S. Trade Rep Greer. Take a listen.
Time matters. How long did it take to negotiate that agreement, the USMCA, that you were part of?
We did it at breakneck speed. We did in about 2 years.
2 years. And now you're telling us you have nearly 50 countries coming to you, approaching you to enter in a negotiation. And you think that you can do that overnight?
India.
Man, you're pretty superhuman here, if that's the case.
So, I mean, you've been in the room where these kind of negotiations are made. The White House has said that President Trump wants to negotiate what they're calling tailor-made trade deals with dozens of countries. Just from a logistical standpoint, how much time and manpower does that require? And is it something that you can do in a matter of weeks? Does it take months? Or could it take years, maybe even longer?
If I had to choose, I would say years. I think any one of these negotiations, at least historically, as you heard from the senator just there, can take many, many months. And again, it took 2 years for the USMCA trade deal that they were just talking about, and that was kind of breakneck speed. So I'm very concerned about the magnitude of what's going on and how long it would take to change it. But I'll say the following. The good part about this, or the part about this that I think is at least healthy for the markets, is if the markets catch a whiff that there's some wiggle room, that there's even the potential for some negotiation, they've shown quite clearly that things can improve. People need a message that at least the White House isn't so dug in that they're going to be impenetrable to any facts or any changes. In a way, I'm really talking about the difference between Navarro on one hand, or Navarro on one hand, and Bessent or Musk on the other hand. And, when the markets think that Bessent is in ascension, they do better. And when they think that when they think Navarro's taking over, they go south. So I really do think that's kind of what the debate boils down to.
You work for President Biden. He and President Trump actually shared the same goal of boosting manufacturing in the United States. President Biden wasn't necessarily opposed to tariffs. He used tariffs strategically to try and encourage manufacturing and to help the United States economy. Is this the best way of accomplishing that goal, kind of this broad tariff policy that Trump is trying to employ?
Far from it. And I think we're seeing opposition. I mean, the unpopularity of Trump's trade war is incredibly pervasive. Basically, if you're not paid to favor this strategy, you're pretty much against it. And that includes, as of yesterday, a bunch of billionaires who bet on Trump in the first place, like Bill Ackman and others. What we tried to do in the Biden administration was to incent investment in manufacturing through tax incentives. And construction of manufacturing factories, construction of factories actually doubled in real terms on our watch. Now, if you go back to Trump 1, you actually had a preview of what we're seeing now. The tariffs, which were a tiny version of what they're talking about now, that mini trade war was actually quite bad for the manufacturing sector. And there's a good reason for it. These tariffs make it a lot more expensive to produce here because American manufacturers import many of their inputs. Apple is an example you just talked about a minute ago. So a great way to make production more expensive and to hurt our manufacturers is to tax every single input they have coming in versus trying to incent greater investment in the sector.
And maybe expand on that a little bit, because I think that's part of where the disconnect here is. Because when President Trump talks about fixing the trade imbalance, in other words, making more stuff here so that Americans can buy stuff made by Americans, that's really a wholesale change to the world economy, right? I mean, it would mean building manufacturing plants that do exactly what you say, not just make iPhones, but make all the parts connected to iPhones. That's something that can't be done in even a 6-month period, right? I mean, how long would something like that take?
The kind of reindustrialization that they're talking about, which I happen to believe is just absolutely not going to happen, would take at least a decade. So that's point one. But point two is that you can't unscramble the globalization omelet. That's the way to think about this. These kinds of measures might have made sense 200 or 300 years ago when the world wasn't nearly as integrated as it is now. But at this point, because of the fact that 45% of our imports are inputs into domestic manufacturing, it just makes it much more expensive to produce here. And proof positive of this is that all the car makers, Stellantis, Ford, GM, they all went to the White House, said, can we get exemptions from the tariffs that are supposed to protect us? Alcoa, the aluminum producer, did the same thing. Can we get exemptions from these tariffs that you say are supposed to help us? Why do they want those exemptions? Because they import some of their inputs, a good chunk of their inputs. We actually have a North American auto production chain, not an American one. And so you're right. It just can't really be unwound without tremendous pain, and I think for little gain.
Okay, a lot of uncertainty, not exactly sure what the end game is. Jared Bernstein, thank you so much for providing us with your insight. We appreciate it. Coming up, making sense of the Supreme Court's ruling as it allows the administration to resume deportations under a controversial wartime law, but also rejects the government's claims that its actions are unreviewable. We'll break down the latest developments. Plus, miles of files. NBC goes inside a former limestone mine filled to the brim with government paperwork. We have an exclusive inside look as Elon Musk zeroes in on the facility. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Last night, the Supreme Court paved the way for the Trump administration to resume deportation flights under the Alien Enemies Act, lifting the temporary restraining order granted by a federal judge. In their 5-4 ruling, the justices didn't address the core issue of whether the administration could invoke the centuries-old wartime power to carry out the deportations, instead ruling that the plaintiffs in the case filed the suit in the wrong court. All 9 justices did, however, rule that any migrants subject to deportation under the Alien Enemies Act must, quote, be given a reasonable time to challenge their removal. Joining me now is NBC News senior Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley. It feels that the Supreme Court does this a lot. They make a ruling, but it's not 100% clear, and it's not going to solve the problem long term. What could happen now? How is this resolved going forward?
Yeah, you're right, Ryan. And depending on who you ask today, there are different winners and different outcomes of this. So the Trump administration is taking a victory lap on this and saying they were completely within their powers to invoke the Alien Enemies Act even during a peacetime. When, in fact, what the Supreme Court really said was that the lower judge, Judge Boasberg's order to put a temporary hold on them using that authority should be lifted, but that anyone who is deported to El Salvador should get a chance to petition for habeas. So to go before a district judge in their own place where they're being detained in the United States and argue that they should not be detained in El Salvador. And in order to do that, the Trump administration has to give them reasonable time, a heads up, in order to file that. They didn't say exactly how much time that would be. And it also doesn't address what happens to the people who are already there. Right. That's the big lingering question.
And they also didn't really get into the separate issue that the judge raised on whether or not the government violated his order by not turning around the plane that he had essentially said was not allowed to leave the country after his ruling.
Yeah, that's the sideshow that really became the main show for a little while, because we thought it could lead to a constitutional crisis if the Trump administration just blatantly said, no, we're not going to listen to you. Now Judge Boasberg has asked the parties involved, including the Trump administration, to file to say if they still think that they have the legal standing to continue this case. But really, whether or not they violated his order could be moot now because that order has since been lifted.
And then separately, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, announcing today it's going to revoke the legal status of migrants who enter the United States using the CBP-1 app during the Biden administration. This could impact a lot of people, right?
Yeah. Now, that app was created by the Biden administration to try to encourage people to make appointments to come through legal ports of entry and claim asylum. And they said it really reduced a lot of illegal border traffic. Now, people who entered that way, and there were hundreds of thousands of them, could have their status in the United States revoked. A lot of them were still in line to see an immigration judge. They might pass that initial hearing, but they have to wait years for an immigration judge to officially say they have asylum, but they were living here, working here legally. And now they could be the lowest hanging fruit because they've given all their information, including where they're living, over to DHS.
So they theoretically could be deported at any time?
Yeah.
Could be the next step?
They've been given notices that that's been revoked, and now they could be those targeted next to be deported.
Okay, Julia Ainsley, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Up next, President Trump's warning to Tehran and why the U.S. and Iran are already clashing over a high-stakes round of nuclear negotiations before they even begin. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. In a surprise to many, President Trump announced yesterday that the U.S. and Iran would engage in direct talks this weekend as he looks to rein in Tehran's nuclear program. In a social media post this morning, Iran's foreign minister confirmed that the talks would happen in Oman on Saturday, but said they would be indirect high-level talks. Yesterday, while speaking in the Oval Office, President Trump had this warning for Iran if the talks did not go well.
I think if the talks aren't successful with Iran, I think Iran is going to be in great danger. And I hate to say it, great danger, because they can't have a nuclear weapon.
Joining me now is NBC News chief Washington correspondent and chief foreign affairs correspondent Andrea Mitchell. And Andrea, you pressed the State Department spokesperson about these talks. I want to play a little bit of that exchange.
Can you define what is meant by direct talks? Because I'm insisting at the foreign minister level that they are indirect.
That's nice for the Iranians. I would refer back to the President of the United States.
So it seems to be a disconnect here between the two sides. What are your sources telling you?
Well, and it's not the first, and it won't be the last. This is a very important distinction because there were indirect talks for 2 years under the Biden administration to try to restart the nuclear, just restart and revise it, improve it beyond the first nuclear agreement agreed to in 2015, signed in 2016 under President Obama. We all covered this negotiation endlessly for years of these talks that were in Vienna and also in Switzerland as well. And the indirect talks for 2 years under President Biden went nowhere. They had to negotiate between the Europeans, so they were in separate places, separate rooms, same building, different floors. They would have to pass something up to the Europeans. The Europeans would present them to the Iranians. The Iranians would take a couple of days to respond. They went nowhere. And now the distinction is the Iranians have still said at the highest level repeatedly in the last couple of weeks, we would agree to indirect talks with President Trump, with the Trump first administration got out of this agreement in 2018 against the wishes of most of the world. The whole world had signed on to it, Russia, China, Europe, the EU. And the Trump administration then laid sanctions on Iran and criticized the Biden administration subsequently and the previous Obama administration for letting Iran get access, they said, to some of its frozen assets, which are actually kept in escrow, so they couldn't use it. But there was a trade made for some American prisoners in Iran. That said, the State Department said today, what the president said is operative, that they will be direct talks. What we do know is that Secretary Rubio is not going to these talks on Saturday in Oman. We know that Steve Witkoff is going and will presumably, the special envoy, lead these negotiations, as he's been the one negotiating with Vladimir Putin and also doing the Middle East negotiations. So he is clearly a key player. And now there's some suggestion they might be in the same room with Oman in between. And there is going to be an argument over what the direct and
distinction of that is. But there's a lot at stake here, right? I mean, what do we know right now about the status of Iran's nuclear capabilities and what could come from these talks?
Well, President Trump told our own Christian Welker on Meet the Press last week in that telephone interview that if Iran does not agree to disable, give up its nuclear program, which Iran says is peaceful, which Israel, the U.S., and the UN say is, far too much enriched uranium to be for peaceful purposes, that if Iran does not give up and dismantle that program, that they will suffer bombing, the likes of which they have never seen before. So that is the threat. The threat is war and peace. Iran is very importantly vulnerable, more vulnerable than ever before, because Israel has taken out many of its air defenses in a previous retaliatory stroke last summer, and because it no longer has Hezbollah in its front door in Lebanon as its first line of defense, its proxy. Hamas has been disabled, leaderless, Hezbollah leaderless, and Syria, Assad has gone from Syria. So without air defenses and without these allies in the region, Iran and, Israel could take out Iran's nuclear facilities, which it couldn't previously, and would presumably have American support. But President Trump says he wants a peaceful solution, and he's talking about diplomacy.
Okay. Andrea Mitchell, thank you so much for that reporting. We appreciate it. And turning now from U.S. diplomacy to the U.S. military, where the Trump administration is considering two major proposals that could have significant implications for America's relationship with its partners and its neighbors. According to 6 U.S. and European officials briefed on the matter, the Trump administration is weighing a proposal to withdraw thousands of U.S. troops from Europe, raising concerns about the continued aggressive stance the administration appears to be taking toward its European allies, especially against the backdrop of Russia's continued assault on Ukraine. Separately, the administration is also looking at carrying out possible drone strikes on Mexican drug cartels as it ramps up its efforts to combat criminal gangs and drug trafficking. Joining me now, NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube at the Pentagon. She had the exclusive reporting on both of these stories. So, Courtney, what more do we know about this proposal to reduce the U.S. force posture in Europe? Is there consensus within the Pentagon on this proposal?
There's not. And what we do know is that this is consistent with what we've heard out of the Trump administration, frankly, since inauguration and probably even before that. And that is their effort here to make Europe take a larger part of their own defense of Europe. We heard that from Vice President Vance when he was in Munich. We've heard it from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. And now, according to these officials, one of the options on the table would be to potentially pull as many as 10,000 of these troops in Eastern Europe out of there and bring them to other areas. Now, these are part of the 20,000 or so troops that President Biden moved forward into Eastern Europe when Russia invaded Ukraine. The idea was to have additional presence there as a deterrent and as support to the allies, the NATO allies in that area. Now, these discussions are not final. It's not clear that this is absolutely going to happen, but the officials we spoke with said this is very much under discussion. Today, during a budget hearing on the Hill, your territory, Ryan, the commander of U.S. European Command and Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, General Cavoli, was asked about the idea of pulling some U.S. troops back from Europe, and he gave a pretty candid answer. Here's what he had to say.
In 2022, we originally surged forces forward. We have periodically reviewed the force structure at both the military level and the policy level. And I have consistently recommended throughout that period to maintain the forces we surged forward. And I would continue to do so now if asked, yeah.
But the reality, Ryan, is even with those recommendations, the policy people may not agree.
And you have some more exclusive reporting today, Courtney, on potential military strikes on drug cartels in Mexico. What do we know about these plans? And I would have to imagine there are a lot of concerns that strikes like this would violate international laws. Break it all down for us.
Yeah, and the idea here, and this is in the early discussion, is the Trump administration would potentially send armed drones into Mexico to go after cartel leaders. Now, this could include not only targeting individuals, leaders of the cartel, but also some of their logistical hubs. And the goal here is to stop the drugs from moving from Mexico into the U.S. From the beginning, the Trump administration has talked about the security at the border as being one of the biggest, if not the biggest, national security priority for this administration. We've already seen them step up surveillance flights over Mexico. That has been in cooperation with the Mexican authorities. And the officials told us the goal here is if they do move forward with these drone strikes, it would be with the cooperation or coordination of the Mexican government. But at this point, Ryan, it's not really clear whether that coordination has actually begun or those talks. We did, after our story published, we heard from the president of Mexico, and she said that she has made it clear to the U.S. government that she doesn't see this as the way to actually deal with the cartel problem. We reached out to the National Security Council for a comment on this. They didn't respond. And actually, at the White House briefing today, our own Gabe Gutierrez asked Caroline Leavitt about this story, and she referred it from the podium, referred it back to the NSC as well. Ryan.
Okay. Courtney Kube, breaking stories right and left. We appreciate it, Courtney. Thank you so much. After the break, the president meets with House Republican holdouts as hardliners rebel against leadership's latest legislative gambit to advance the administration's agenda. Our panel's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Turning now to Capitol Hill, and I caught up with some Senate Republicans earlier today that seemed hopeful that the White House's negotiations with U.S. trading partners could forego some of these new tariffs, while also acknowledging that what actually happens next is largely up to one person, the president.
It's going to take a while to be able to resolve this. I think the clear signal the president can give is what they've already started to signal, is that we are going to negotiate.
President Trump is a little bit now he's like the pit bull that caught the car. What are you going to do with the car? He's got these foreign nations up to the lick log, as they say on a farm. What do we do next? Whether this will have a happy ending or a sad ending depends in large part what President Trump does next.
Joining me now on set is Molly Ball, senior political correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, Anthony Coley, Democratic communications staffer and an NBC News political analyst, and Pete C., former White House spokesman for President George W. Bush. Molly, when I think of that analogy that Senator Kennedy is using about the dog catching the car, generally that's not a good thing when the dog catches the car.
For the dog or the car?
For either, I think, yeah. Senator Kennedy was much more muted in his concerns about tariffs today than he's been in the past. But it's clear that there's some anxiety among congressional Republicans about how the administration lands this plane.
Absolutely. And you heard that from Senator Langford as well in the confirmation hearing for the U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer this morning, getting a lot of tough questions, not just from Democrats, from a lot of Republicans, really pushing him, saying, what is the strategy? What is the end game here? And that's the question the markets are asking as well, right? They're saying, is it going to be a negotiation? Is this going to be a permanent regime? Which is it? And the president has been asked this question, and he said, oh, well, it's both. And that's obviously not a satisfying answer if you are the business community and you're just looking for some kind of certainty. And I think what we saw in the, the slide that happened before the markets closed is that they just still haven't gotten that.
And all these Republicans keep telling us over and over again, give the president time. He'll figure this out. How much time can they actually give him?
I think it's a really open question. I think we do see incrementally that this ratchet continues, that the anxiety is more and more public with every passing day, that we hear more and more of this stuff on the record instead of just in juicy background quotes with every passing day, because every day they wake up hopeful that the president is going to change his mind or at least find some, face-saving off-ramp. And with every day that doesn't happen, they get a little bit more anxious, and they see the political climate starting to darken as well.
Pete, there is one Republican, Don Bacon of Nebraska. He's in a district that Kamala Harris won. He's perpetually in a tough race every single year, who's outright saying that he thinks it's a bad idea. He told us today he wants it to be more strategic. He doesn't understand why the president just doesn't go back to the USMCA when it comes to Canada, because, of course, that was a deal that Trump negotiated. Is there going to be some more critique, at least a more narrow critique from some of these Republicans that are going to say, listen, I like the idea, I like what you're trying to do here, but it needs to be a little bit more targeted?
Yeah, we've heard that from a lot of Republicans. We've also heard that from Democrats who have said they're not adamantly opposed to tariffs. They just believe it should be more strategically deployed than this blanket global policy that President Trump has utilized. But I would just remind everyone, it was not even a week ago. It was last Wednesday that this announcement was made. And we just live in a hyperactive world right now where there's a new outrage du jour every single day. And a couple of days of a bad market dip is not necessarily going to make a policy. Today, yeah, it went down, but it was negligible. It was, a couple hundred points. It was like 500 points, 1%. Yeah. The market is a lot larger than it was. The Dow, the S&P is a lot bigger than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. So the percentage is a lot lower. We look at that raw number and we see, 500, 700, 1,000 point dip, and we freak out thinking that this is still the 1980s, and it's not. So we'll have to see how it all plays out, how some of these negotiations take place. But I would say this, the plan is whatever happens, that will be the plan.
Yes, I think that's often been Donald Trump's theory. But, Anthony, I want to pin this down. The Dow's down 11% in 4 days. I don't care how big the market is. That's a significant drop if you're looking at your 401k and you're counting on that to retire. How long does President Trump have with the average American that has got a 401k, that is relying on this, is thinking about this, especially when you take into account that the stock market was one of the big things that Donald Trump pointed to when he was president in his first term?
Right. What we're hearing from the president, what we just heard from Pete, conveying what the president says, just trust me. And what's so problematic with this admonition to just trust him is that is absolutely against what independent, conservative, even economists say are appropriate or that will happen with tariffs. It's against people's political instincts, right? And so what we know for sure that if Donald Trump wants to, if he really has an interest in getting this country back on track, at some point you got to start paying attention to the data and to the experts, not on his own political instincts.
So, Molly, I want to play some more of what Republican senators had to say during their hearing with Jameson Greer, the trade representative, today, to talk more about this.
I don't often agree with the members on the other side of the aisle, but in many cases here today, particularly when they're expressing concern about small businesses in their states, I'm hoping you're very, and I hope you and the president are very sensitive about companies potentially going bankrupt by these actions.
In this scenario, the decision maker who decided the alla prima approach, who has obviously had to have spent time anticipating what we saw in the markets and some of the pushback. I'm assuming this all got gamed out because it's a novel approach. It needed to be thought out. Whose throat do I get to choke if this proves to be wrong?
So Tom Tillis is up for re-election in less than 2 years. Ron Johnson serves is maybe the swingiest state in the country. Are they a little bit more perceptive as to how the Americans feel about this because they're going to be on a ballot again and Donald Trump theoretically won't be?
Well, look, every member of the United States House of Representatives is on the ballot in November 2026, and they've been hearing a lot from their constituents as well. And when you talk to Republicans, you get the sense that it is starting to dawn on them that this might not be a negotiating strategy, that the president might have meant it when he said hundreds, if not thousands of times over the past 10 years that he actually just really loves tariffs and wants to keep them in place so they can bring, in his mind, trillions of dollars into the Treasury. And I think that what these Republicans fear more than not knowing what the game plan is that he's told them the game plan and they don't like it.
Yeah, that's right.
Because they don't like what they think the consequences of it will be because, there's a real divide in the Republican Party between the sort of party of Reagan that believes in free trade and laissez-faire economics and the protectionist Trumpian strain, which has been on the march for the past 10 years, which now has a substantial purchase in Congress and among Republicans, true believers who are behind Trump's approach on this.
So here's what's so interesting here. They have made the case privately, telling Donald Trump's White House, this is a bad idea, and it fell on deaf ears. The second thing they did, they went public, right, with their hope. You know what? If you're going to do it, you should exempt some of our home state interests, right, which is what senators and members of Congress are apt to do. That didn't go anywhere. And so now they're at the point of, all right, so since both of those things have fallen on deaf ears, we are going to partner with Democrats to try to slow this down. The fact of the matter is that even if congressional leadership allowed these votes to go forward, and that's a big if, there is no way that it would, even if it passed, Donald Trump would veto these bills.
He's already threatened that.
Right, he's already threatened it, and there's not 2/3 of a majority to override a veto. So the bottom line here is that if Republicans really do want to stop these tariffs, think about changing parties, right? We are someplace, think about Arlen Specter, right? When I was on the Hill and all these other folks.
We have less than 30 seconds, so Pete, how does Donald Trump land this plane?
Well, the challenge is you've got, and I hate the word establishment, but I'll use it for ease of understanding. You've got the establishment, which is the senators and members of Congress who are saying one thing. They're the Reaganites, the Bushites who believe in free trade. But you have the base of the party, the working class voters of America who elected Donald Trump, who are ready to fight back and avenge the jobs that they lost over the last several decades.
All right, we got to go there. Thanks, guys. We appreciate it so much. Still to come, NBC's Garrett Hake got an exclusive look at a literal mountain of paperwork that's drawing the attention of Elon Musk and Doge. Welcome back. As the Department of Government Efficiency works to overhaul the federal government, one of its less controversial plans is to update a system that's quite literally in the dark. Believe it or not, all federal retirement paperwork is currently stored inside what was once a limestone mine in Pennsylvania. It is 220 feet below ground and the size of nearly 2.5 football fields. It can take months for the Office of Personnel Management to process a retirement because it's all done on paper. There are 400 million records kept at this facility in more than 26,000 filing cabinets. For perspective, if you stacked all those filing cabinets up, they would reach more than 4 times the height of Mount Everest. My colleague Garrett Hake got a rare look inside the mine and talked to the Doge staffer tasked with updating the system.
Ryan, I'm maybe 200 feet underground in Boyers, Pennsylvania, at this Iron Mountain facility where OPM has had a facility since 1960 processing federal government retirement paperwork. Most of it looks like this. For row after row, filing cabinets, in many cases stacked 10 high, full of the paperwork that it requires to retire from the federal government. Basically, if you retired from the government since 1960, at least at some point your paperwork, and it is paper, has passed through here, much of it still stored in this facility. For DOJ and for the Trump administration, this was an easy target. This was something they identified within the first week as something that they wanted to try to modernize, try to use their technical savvy to bring into the 21st century. Tasked with that is a man named Joe Gebbia, who is one of the co-founders of Airbnb, who is trying to turn what you see here into something he describes as more of a Apple Store-like experience for retirees and even for the folks who work here. Trying to modernize this system is not a new effort, right? Why do you think it has been so hard to bring this retirement system more fully into the 21st century?
It's a complicated project. I think what's different this time is there is a mandate and an executive order and a team that can help collaborate with the retirement services folks to help usher this over the edge.
This isn't the first effort to try to modernize the processes here, the first effort to try to digitize, but it may be the one with the most resources behind it. Just a few weeks ago, the OPM team here says they were able to go their first digital retirement. Basically, no piece of paper was produced. They challenged themselves to get this done in a week. They ultimately did it in 2 days. It's a proof of concept for that team, and I think also for the Trump administration, that what they are doing is not inherently political in the sense that it doesn't necessarily have to be controversial, and the DOJ doesn't necessarily just mean cuts. It can mean the kind of modernization that they initially talked about at the launch. Now, it won't be easy and it won't be quick, but the team with us here today was here touring the facility as well, doing the research, starting to put the legwork in to really take on what is a massive project here underground, literally millions of pieces of paper that they're going to try to move into the digital era. Ryan?
Fascinating. Garrett, thank you so much for that in-depth reporting. And now turning now to a noticeable shift in our politics. We've talked a lot about last week's 10-point victory for the liberal-leaning judge in Wisconsin's Supreme Court election and what that could mean for the midterms. But there was another interesting result in that election. NBC's Steve Kornacki is at the big board with a referendum vote in Wisconsin that went a bit under the radar.
All right, yeah, we all know last week, big day for Democrats in Wisconsin, the Democratic-aligned candidate winning by 10 points in that state Supreme Court race. But on the same day, Democrats also suffered a big loss in Wisconsin on an argument over an issue that has been pretty prominent in politics now for almost 2 decades, and that issue is voter ID. There was a constitutional amendment on the ballot in Wisconsin also last Tuesday. It said basically, look, there is a state law in Wisconsin requiring voters to have ID to vote. They said, let's put that, Republicans had advanced this, let's put that in the state constitution, and voters said yes, overwhelmingly. Look, basically 63% yes, 37 no, basically a 26-point margin right there. And you can see it here, 72 counties in Wisconsin, 70 of them voting for it, only 2 against it. They're the 2 big Democratic counties. This is Dane County, where Madison is. This is Milwaukee County, obviously, where Milwaukee is. And we talked about this after the election. In that court election last week, the electorate was more Democratic than usual. Democratic voters were more motivated to turn out. And yet, you think about this, Democrats now, as we say, for almost 2 decades, Democrats have been sounding the alarm about voter ID laws, saying these disenfranchised non-white voters, it's a solution in search of a problem. And yet, even in this electorate last week, a very Democratic-friendly electorate, voter ID passes overwhelmingly. Take Milwaukee County, by the way. Again, big Democratic county here, 51-49 on this voter ID question. That was the result. Voter ID got 49% in one of the most Democratic counties in Wisconsin. It means a lot of Democratic voters aren't with their party's leaders on this question, aren't with the activists in their party on this question. And this isn't just a Wisconsin last week story. This is basically a 2-decade story. This is voter ID and how it has polled since it became sort of a flashpoint issue in the aughts, in the mid-late aughts. Look at this, just consistent, overwhelming support. And again, something we saw in Wisconsin last week. And the question this all raises is, we've talked about how the 2-party coalitions are changing, how the Democrats, back when this all started, the Democrats relied a lot more on voters who turned out in presidential races, like, for Barack Obama twice, but not necessarily lower turnout elections. Republicans back then, it was more the opposite. We've seen those coalitions really start to shift in the last 20 years, and especially in the last election. The question coming out of Wisconsin is, from a political standpoint, are Democrats going to keep fighting this, or has the issue for them politically run its course?
Fascinating stuff. Thank you, Steve, for that reporting. And we'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. The news continues, though, with Tom Costello. He's in for Hallie Jackson right now. Have a great day.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.